What if John Wilkes Booth didn't assassinate Abraham Lincoln and ran for president in 1968? John Wilkes Booth gets the Republican nomination in 1868, choosing Ulysses S. Grant as his running mate. The Democrats nominated Horatio Seymour and Andrew Johnson. 1968 U.S. election. Booth, Grant via Seymour, Johnson. John Wilkes Booth wins 1968 due to being a rich and famous actor who many women really like. Booth's first term would continue Reconstruction and even continuing the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. As in this timeline, Booth doesn't hate Lincoln. 1972 U.S. election. Booth, Grant vs. Johnson, Greeley. Andrew Johnson continues on criticizing Abraham Lincoln for no reason and making slavery legal again. Booth campaigned on continuing his own legacy and continuing Reconstruction. John Wilkes Booth wins re-election in 1872. John Wilkes Booth would continue Reconstruction policies and would have a good second term. Although the Democrats do win the Senate in the 1974 midterms, the Republicans are still very popular though. 1976 U.S. election. Grant Hayes vs. Tilden Hendricks. Samuel Tilden wins in 1876. But however, Samuel J. Tilden would have an extremely bad term. He signs the Omnibus and Reconciliation Act, which brings back slavery. Even though his cabinet members warned him not to sign it, Tilden didn't listen to them, and slavery was brought back, making him extremely unpopular, which is the reason why Andrew Johnson could not have won in 1872 when running against incumbent President John Wilkes Booth. But anyway, Samuel Tilden would also raise tariffs and raise taxes. 1880 U.S. election. Hayes Garfield vs. Tilden Hendricks. Rutherford B. Hayes easily wins 1880 with a landslide. Unlike in real life, Hayes runs for re-election in 1884, having a good first presidential term, making slavery illegal and banning alcohol. The Democrats would go with Grover Cleveland. And Grover Cleveland would nominate James B. Weaver. Rutherford B. Hayes wins re-election in 1884. 1888 U.S. election. Garfield Harrison vs. Cleveland Roosevelt. James Garfield easily wins the election with a landslide of 319 electoral votes. Garfield would have a good first one, continuing on Rutherford B. Hayes and Abraham Lincoln's and Booth's legacy, and continuing on his own legacy too. Finally ending Reconstruction policies. And by this time, every former Confederate state had rejoined the Union. And no longer would the states of America use a vote to cast its electors. In 1892, Theodore Roosevelt, who's a Democrat that's on the timeline, gets the Democratic nomination. We don't know who he picks as his running mate. 1892 U.S. election. Roosevelt vs. Garfield Harrison. James Garfield wins re-election narrowly in 1892, but the panic of 1893 would continue to rage on, making Garfield more unpopular over time. But the Republicans were still able to win the House and Senate. 1996 U.S. election. Harrison Logan vs. Roosevelt Parker. Benjamin Harrison surprisingly wins in 1896, narrowly, with 288 electoral votes. Well, Harrison is very popular. He gets pneumonia. And Benjamin Harrison resigns from the presidency in 1895. That time, John A. Logan would be the Republican nominee in 1900 with James G. Blaine vs. Roosevelt Parker. Again, Theodore Roosevelt wins 1900. Theodore Roosevelt would continue the legacy of former Democratic presidents such as Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson. 1904 U.S. election. Roosevelt Parker vs. Taft Debs. Theodore Roosevelt wins re-election in 1908 easily. In 1908, a meteor explodes and lands on Russia 6 miles off the ground, having the power of 650 Hiroshima, and Nagasaki bombs. Theodore Roosevelt does get an assassination attempt in 2011, but he survives the 1911 assassination attempt. 1912 U.S. election. Wilson Marshall vs. Taft Debs. Woodrow Wilson wins the election, continuing on Theodore Roosevelt's legacy. World War I would break out in 1916, even though he promised not to get the country into war. He becomes more unpopular for that, but it's still looking like he will win re-election heading into 1916 U.S.A. election. Debs McAdoo, who are both Republicans in this timeline, vs. Wilson Marshall. Woodrow Wilson wins re-election in 1916, narrowly, with 288 electoral votes. 1920 U.S. election. Hoover Coolidge vs. McAdoo Smith. Herbert Hoover wins 1920. There is a depression from 1920 to 1921, but the economy is quickly recovering, and there would be no Teapot Dome scandal. The Roaring Twenties are now in full swing, when everything to become more moderate. The Democrats would nominate Robert M. La Follette with John W. Davis. Herbert Hoover easily wins re-election in the 1924 election with 417 electoral votes. There's a hurricane in 1926, and the stock market keeps going up in an obvious bubble, and it looks like that a Great Depression might occur after 1928 U.S. election. 1928 U.S. election. McAdoo Roosevelt vs. Curtis Wilkie. Franklin D. Roosevelt wins easily in 1928, handling the Great Depression very well with his New Deal, supporting things like child labor rights, a Federal Reserve Act, and continuing women's rights and child labor laws and health care and tax cuts and voting rights for working families. 1932 U.S. election. McAdoo Roosevelt versus Lyndon Dewey. William Gets McAdoo wins re-election in 1932 with a landslide victory. The Great Depression would come to an end in 1934. That year, the Democrats win the House and Senate. 1936 U.S. election. Roosevelt Truman vs. Wilkie Wallace. Franklin D. Roosevelt easily wins in 1936. Continuing on, William Gets McAdoo's legacy. 1940 U.S. election. Roosevelt Truman vs. Dewey Wilkie. Theodore Roosevelt wins re-election in 1940. The attacks on Pearl Harbor would happen in 1943. The start of World War II, which is the biggest war in this timeline. By election day, 1944, things were going much better for the Allies, as the forces of Germany and the Nazi had severely weakened. 1944 U.S. election, Truman Wallace vs. Station Taft. Harry Truman wins 1944. The Korean War would happen just a year later in 1949. In this timeline, 1948 U.S. election. Harry Truman vs. Dewey Stassen. Thomas Dewey wins in 1948. The reason why Truman lost the election is because many people are getting tired of the Democrats dominating the White House. Dewey has a good first presidential term, continuing on women's rights and voting fraud. 1952 U.S. election, Dewey Stassen vs. Kennedy Stevenson. Thomas E. Dewey wins re-election in 1952. 1956 U.S. election, Kennedy Stevenson vs. Stassen Nixon. John F. Kennedy wins in 1956 easily of 388 electoral votes. A small recession would happen in 1959, blaming the Kennedy administration for it. But the economy would quickly recover, with Kennedy getting all the credit for it. Even though Lyndon B. Johnson, Adlai Stevenson, and Hubert Humphrey did challenge him, Kennedy was easily renominated. 1960 U.S. election, Kennedy Stevenson vs. Nixon Eisenhower. John F. Kennedy wins re-election in 1960, despite some potential debates in which he lost. The Battle Payton visit would happen in 1961, and the Soviet Union would flee from communists. JFK policies would kind of be a bit war-hawkish when it comes to foreign policies. John F. Kennedy would not be assassinated in 1963. A year later, in 1964, he signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964. U.S. election. Stevenson Johnson vs. Wallace Lodge Jr. Adlai Stevenson easily wins the election, continuing on his legacy. Easily. The Vietnam War would start. Making Adlai Stevenson pretty unpopular. 1968 U.S. election. Stevenson Johnson vs. Nixon Lodge Jr. Richard Nixon wins in 1968. The Watergate scandal would happen in 1971, but not a lot of people would know about it. And yet, 4 years later, just like in real life, Nixon hadn't kept his campaign promise to end the war. 1972 U.S. election. Benson McGovern vs. Nixon Lodge Jr. Richard Nixon runs and wins again with 500 electoral votes. The Watergate scandal would force him to resign on August 9, 1974, with Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. becoming president. He gets renominated to run again in 1976 U.S. election. Lodge Jr. Agnew vs. Carter Mondale. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. wins in 1976. The hostage Iran crisis would still happen in 1981 in this timeline. 1980 U.S. election. Lodge Jr. Agnew vs. Kennedy Falardo. Ted Kennedy wins 1980 easily with 388 electoral votes. The reason why is because now a lot of people were getting tired of conservative leadership of the Republicans. Ted Kennedy continues on John F. Kennedy's legacy and his own legacy too, I might add. All of the people who are hostage gets released in about like mid 1983, 1984 U.S. election. Kennedy Falardo vs. Reagan Bush. Surprisingly, Ted Kennedy wins re-election in 1984. Why did it shock many people? Because of how popular Reagan was. And Bush was also a bit popular too. Not much to say about his second term. 1988 U.S. election. Falardo Mondale vs. Bush Quayle. Geraldine Falardo wins 1988 as the first woman president. 1992 U.S. election. Falardo Mondale vs. Dorr Quayle. Geraldine Falardo wins re-election in 1992. Geraldine Falardo would continue on both Ted and John's legacy. The Persian Gulf War would happen in this timeline, but it would go very smooth. The Persian Gulf War would happen somewhere between late 1994 and early and mid 1995. 1996 U.S. election. Clinton Gore vs. W. Bush Pillow. Bill Clinton easily wins 1996 with a landslide. The Monica Lewinsky scandal still happens in 1998. He gets impeached. He doesn't get kicked out of office by just one vote. 2000 U.S. election. W. Bush Pillow vs. Clinton Gore again. George W. Bush surprisingly wins 2000. Bush knows how to handle 9/11. It starts on September 12th and starts on September 11th. The Iraq War would happen in 2003 with the 2004 tsunami killing 167,000 people in 2004. U.S. election. Clinton Biden vs. Bush Perot. George W. Bush wins re-election in 2004. There would be no 2008 recession, as in this timeline it would happen in 2012. 2012 U.S. election, Clinton-Obama vs. Palin-Cheney. Hillary Clinton destroys Sarah Palin, easily winning with 388 electoral votes. Like I said earlier, the Great Recession would start in 2012. 2012 U.S. election, Buchanan-Pence vs. Clinton-Obama. Hillary Clinton wins re-election in 2012, continuing on Bill Clinton's legacy, policy, and work. 2016 U.S. election, Obama-Kane vs. Kasich-Rubio. Barack Obama wins 2016, working on Obamacare. Obamacare would support healthcare and deregulation and beefing on military spending in this timeline. The COVID-19 pandemic would happen in 2019, killing almost 230,000 Americans. 2020 U.S. election, Obama-Kane vs. Bush-Cruz. Barack Obama wins re-election in 2020 despite COVID. COVID would not come to an end. It still keeps on going. And the Ukraine and Gaza war also happens. 2024 U.S. election, Kane-Harris vs. Cruz-Bush. Ted Cruz wins 2024. This brings us to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe.